So we move on then to Senate File 1872, a bill related to K-12 scholarships. And I'm told that there's an amendment to this one. Senator Chamberlain, would you like to offer your amendment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We do have we're going to do the author's amendment for now. The other one is a real technical amendment for a reference. But I have the A1 author's amendment. It just simply clarifies the definition of qualified scholarship, qualified foundation.
Okay, the A1 amendment was before us. Any questions? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay, and the A1 amendment is to the bill. Senator Chamberlain, I'm also told that there's a revised fiscal note, too, in our packets here, so
yes.
For your information. Senator Chamberlain, proceed, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Start by, again, thanking co-authors, Senator Gazelka, Senator Pratt, Senator Senjum, for their support on this, and others through the last couple of years for the support on this important piece of legislation. I'd also like to just acknowledge the schools that are here supporting. They're in the audience. Torah Academy in St. Louis Park, St. Paul Claver School in St. Paul, St. Helena School in Minneapolis, Risen Christ School in Minneapolis, Ascension School in Minneapolis, Cristo Rey High School in Minneapolis, and John Paul II School in Minneapolis. All those schools have people here representing them today, and perhaps others I did not mention. So, members, in Minnesota, there are a lot of great schools and many great teachers and educators, but something is wrong. We all admit it. We see the data, whether it's reading scores, math scores, achievement gap. Talk about it all the time. It's in all of our conversations, especially those of us who are in K-12. So something is wrong, and too many kids are being left behind. They're being left out and denied the same opportunities as many others are. So the time has come for new solutions and new opportunities to solve some old, stubborn education problems in the 21st century. I am, as others are, proud to stand with all these parents behind us and in places that are, and people who are not here today, and with students to support the Equity and Opportunity Scholarships Act. This is about educational freedom and hope for a better future for our state's students. We're not here to blame anyone. We're not here pointing fingers at anyone. This is not an either-or conversation. That is, it's not either public schools or nothing, or private schools or nothing. It's a both-and conversation. We can have both function and thrive in this state. In fact, time has come for both. This is about empowering parents, kids, and educators. This is about allowing parents to choose the education that is best for their children. It's about opportunities and new hope for those kids and for those families and for educators. In your packet, there's a two-page handout, front and back. Then you have 3 single pages, plus some questions and answers about constitutional issues. On that single page with the front and back, you'll see a discussion, a description of the bill and how it functions, as well as some polling numbers. The statewide poll on opportunity scholarship grants is this: 65% statewide support these grants, this sort of school funding system for parents. 78% of African Americans support this act. 90% of Latinos support this act. That's in Minnesota. So we allow choice in the pre-K AWARE program. We give state money to parents to take their kids to AWARE program schools, and they can be private or public schools. We give state money in higher education grants, and those parents can then choose private colleges or public universities. But we don't do that for K-12. So we do it in the beginning, in the end, in the front and the back. but in the middle, they're denied that same opportunity. Mr. Chair and members, empowering parents puts the right people in charge, the parents and their children, and not politicians or bureaucrats. Minnesota can be a leader and truly give every child an opportunity to achieve greatness in this state. There was an old quote, and I can't remember who said it, but I thought it caught it very well, this whole concept. This will liberate parents, children, and educators, and vastly improve outcomes for all students across the state, both public and private. So members, this is what we need for these kids in the 21st century. We need to give them hope, new opportunities, and this is a solution that helps us solve that problem. And members, I should have walked through the bill real quickly, and I'll do that now. First page is simply some IRS references, add backs, the way the code is written and the way this works, and with the new Conformity Act, there were some changes to the regs, so you end up having to add back portions of the deduction of the credit from Minnesota. You take it in the federal, so you have to add back parts on that, so then you take the credit again in Minnesota. Page 2 shows an inflation adjustment. Section 4 is about, explains the credit itself, who's eligible. Then we go into definitions on page 3, I'm sorry. You go into definitions. I'll make note that on line 3.22 and 3.23, it applies a qualified school is a school that adheres to and applies provisions of U.S. Code Title 42, which is a non-discrimination code, and of Minnesota Statutes 363A, which is our human rights statute. A qualified school has to adhere to those principles and laws and ideas. The top of page 4 is where we clarified the definition of qualified foundation. See that in the amendment. Again, more definitions. Line 4.14 talks about 70% state average general education revenue is what the qualified scholarship would be. So it'd be 70% of whatever the basic form, the formula ends up being. Credit allowed at the bottom of page 4, subdivision 2. The maximum credit is, in that list, the maximum credit for individuals and for corporate contributors. Page 5 is about, please note, 5.5, this is non-refundable credit. It's a non-refundable credit. It also applies to corporations, partnerships. There's a carryover factor to this. You can carry it forward. Bottom of page 5, subdivision 3, the process of getting the credit. And it also notes on 5.25 the amount of the credit. Very bottom, 5.32, we start talking about responsibilities of the qualified foundation, which there are many, not the least of which of how you apply to become a qualified foundation with the department, what you have to do to maintain that certification, and the documents and the financial oversight that are required. They also note that on page 7, line 7.8, they have to these schools have to, qualified school, they have to administer the MCAs or a norm reference test. So they have to do MCAs or a norm reference test. And again, the rest of the page is about what the qualified foundation has to be, requirements, et cetera, et cetera. Page 8, responsibility of the commissioner. By the way, the foundation can retain up to 5% of the amount received for administrative costs. And responsibilities of the commissioner. And finally, page 9, again, further processes, dates, times, deadlines. And we make a note on 9.16 that this, I should have noted earlier, that we added here that, not that we necessarily did, we wanted to add for clarification that this also applies to, this credit is available to children who have disabilities, so 504s and IEPs. can get this credit specifically. And 9.16 talks about the special education services. And the last part is just subdivision 2 in the bottom 9 is just the statutory requirement for why we're providing this credit. So members, that's the bill. Those are my opening comments. That's the bill. And now we are free to go on to testifiers.
Okay, are there questions for Senator Chamberlain? Senator Bach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Chamberlain, I'm curious about a word.
A word?
On line 9.29, where we talk about the purpose of the scholarships. On line 9.29, the last word in the sentence says better educational opportunities.
Yes.
And then it says it again down on line 9.32. I'm just kind of wondering what better educational opportunities are, and if there's maybe a better word, then better. Alternative, or I mean, there might be a number of reasons that parents might want to enroll their kids in a different institution. I'm just not sure that better is, that's pretty subjective. I'm not sure it's the right word. And I don't necessarily have a suggestion, but something like alternative educational opportunities or something else might be more appropriate. Just a suggestion.
Mr. Chair, Senator Bach, point well taken. You are correct. It is fairly subjective. I'm sure it was, we used it simply because, you know, if a parent is seeking something else, maybe they're seeking something better, but you're right, it's an alternative. So I would not disagree with that. So we'll make note of that and we'll make that adjustment. Thank you, Senator Bach. And by the way, it's Claver School, not Clover, Claver School. I got it right here, the pronunciation. Okay, thank you.
Senator Dietzig and then Senator Miller. Senator Dietzig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Chamberlain, for the A1 amendment. I did have some questions, and I think that clears up some of the confusions. I didn't know if some of the, in some places you had qualified foundations and qualified public school foundations, and other times you didn't have both, and I didn't know if that was intentional for some reason or just a drafting oversight. So I appreciate that. That is helpful. And for the students from St. Paul, Pope John Paul II, and Ascension, I played basketball against those schools many, 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 many years ago.
Thank you, Senator Dietzig, Mr. Chair.
Senator Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Chamberlain, and maybe your testifiers will cover this, but can you just walk us through exactly how this would work as far as an individual or corporation can make a donation to who, and then how does that money get to the students, and how do they determine which students get the scholarship?
Thank you, Senator Miller. Mr. Chair, so what happens is first we have to have a scholarship granting organization, a qualified foundation. You have to have one of those. They have to be formed, and they have to be formed in accordance with this and with as a 501c3. First, they have to be nonprofit. They also have to get a certificate application from the Department of Revenue. So you have to have a 501c3 by IRS. They have to be nonprofit. They would apply for an application with the Department of Revenue. Once you have the, we'll call it an SGO. The SGO is the foundation, the qualified foundation. An individual, me or you or anybody else, corporation, business, could contribute to that qualified foundation. If we give $1,000 to that qualified foundation, we get a certificate back from that foundation that says we contributed $1,000. Two paths now. One, to get the credit, then you got to get the certificate from the foundation. The department will create that certificate along with the application, and then you use that to submit to the IRS, to the Department of Revenue for the credit on when you do your tax return. The credit will be only 70% of the total amount you give. So if you give $1,000, you get $700 on credit, not the full amount. It is capped, as you see on page 4. There's a maximum amount allowed, so married joint filers you can have a maximum contribution of $30,000 in 1 year, of which you're only going to get 70% back. Individuals, they can contribute $15,000 maximum, and they get 70% back. And then corporations, $150,000 contribution. So that's the tax side of it. On the foundation side of it, for issuing to the students and the families, instead of being a back-end credit for the students and the families, it's a front-end credit scholarship. The parent applies, makes application to the foundation. The foundation ensures that these parents are qualified mostly by income status. Income status is based on the federal free and reduced lunch program. And incidentally, so that goes up. We do twice the amount of that, so low and middle income. For example, 4 people for a family of 4, the double amount would be around $90,000. So you're a family of 4, the 2 times the federal free and reduced lunch number is roughly $46,000, 45 and a half. So that family would qualify at $90,000 for credit for a scholarship from that foundation. So the foundation then reviews the application, and they cannot discriminate, as I mentioned in the referencing U.S. Code and state statute. They cannot pick one school. They cannot donors cannot earmark money for a student. We cannot pick particular schools and just feed kids to one school. Qualify through application, can't earmark money, non-discriminatory, and the qualified foundation is responsible for picking qualified schools. Qualified schools, as you see in the statute, also had to meet certain requirements. By the way, we also have 2 other pieces of this qualified public school foundation, so you could create a qualified public school foundation as well, and then those funds would be created the same way, and those funds could be used for public school, kids going to public school. And as well as transportation scholarships, if a student needs transportation aid to get to a particular school, then the foundation would issue that money to them as well. So that is how it goes. That's the general process. Does that help? Did I miss something?
Senator Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Chamberlain. And just so I'm clear, as long as the school qualifies and the family and student qualifies, this is a statewide program, correct?
Yes, Senator Miller, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Okay.
Maybe I said too much. I'm sorry.
Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chair and Senator Chamberlain, I think when you walk through the bill, Section 4, Subdivision 6, this was something that was talked about a couple of years ago with regards to special education services, and I think an amendment on the floor. But can you touch on that? I know there's probably going to be some testifying, and there's also a letter in our packet from Pacer. But can you touch on the requirements that this bill has to, I believe, fall along with IDEA and Minnesota state law?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Anderson. Right, so there's a couple pieces to that. The bill in and of itself in its original form didn't really need us to add in families with disabilities, children with disabilities. But I wanted to put it in to make it very clear that you could create this scholarship is available to those children with disabilities. And you could go a lot of different ways with that. Some states have schools that are set up simply for children with disabilities, autism or dyslexia or what have you. So you could end up doing something like that eventually. Or you could, my personal preference was lifting the income cap for parents with children with disabilities. In other words, if you have a child that has disability, there's no income capped to the qualifying for this scholarship. But right now, the income caps still apply. So first, the bill as it stands, it could do it. I wanted to clarify it. Secondly, federal law requires that all schools across the country, if a child lives in your district, you have to provide the services you have to provide must be comparable. So you have a child going to your school, and the child that's not going to your school, you need to provide service to that child, comparable services. Minnesota law, statute 125, goes further, and it states that the school will provide services to all children with disabilities in the district. So if you live in District 1, for example, and you have a child that's disabled and your child is homeschooled or going to a private school, the district has to provide special education services to that child per statute 125. The district then receives shared time revenue. That child is in a private school and the public school is providing special education services through an IEP, 504. That school receives compensation. Now, some people will argue that that's not the compensation, and the reimbursement is never enough. Special education discussion that we have around here, which is fair and right. So federal statute is a little bit broader. Minnesota says if that child's in your district, public, private, homeschooled, you have to provide those special education services to that child, and you are compensated for that. There was a court case in Minnesota in 2008, Independent School District 281 against the Minnesota Department of Education, went to Minnesota Supreme Court. District 181 said that they denied initially the child certain services. They didn't deny everything, that's not denied certain services. They were taken to court, and the Supreme Court said, well, MDE ruled in the family's favor based on statutes. So went to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court in Minnesota said, yes, the Minnesota Department of Education was correct. They applied statute 125 and then reimbursement of 126 for the school, and found in favor of the student and the family. So federal law requires it. Minnesota law is more strict, requires more. And then we also require, I think that law was passed, part of that was passed in 06, requires compensation to the school for those services that they rendered. So it's available. They will not, that treatment of the disabled child who needs special ed does not change. It is there, and it is available either through the private school or with the public, or coordinating with the public school. Does that help? Is that too much information?
Other questions? I think Senator Franson had one, or comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Chamberlain. I'd like to see, you mentioned in your testimony the percentage of communities of color that support this type of direction. If you can pinpoint, I'm looking through the information we have in front of us. I don't know if it's in here or if we can make that available, that'd be great.
Sure.
And then my overall struggle with this bill, and we've heard it before, our state constitution basically frames education as a fundamental right for Minnesotans, for public schools.
Yep.
I'm going to quote from the Constitution for those of you who haven't heard it in a while. The stability of a republican form of government depending mainly upon the intelligence of the people, if it is the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools. The legislature shall make such provisions by taxation or otherwise as will secure a thorough and efficient system of public schools throughout the state. In your testimony, also, Senator Chamberlain mentioned that it's your opinion that we're failing in that, and I think there's room for improvement. I'll agree with you on that. Furthermore, the Constitution also states, and I quote, "In no case shall any public money or property be appropriated or used for support of schools wherein the distinctive doctrines, creeds, or tenets of any particular Christian or other religious sects are promulgated or taught." I went to a private school, and it was Baptist. My parents saved for it, and I grew up in a middle-class family, and I know they had to give up a lot to make us go through those schools with the expenditures. I also went to private school, public school in high school, so I benefited from both systems. I know you mentioned Cristo Rey, and I've actually visited Cristo Rey. They're fantastic. They're a great school that serves a great purpose, but they also have a tie to religion. So my question to you is, have you thought about, you mentioned a few court cases. I would think this bill would be suspect for a potential constitutional challenge, and have you thought about that, and what are your responses, and what that would entail? Because I would hate to be spending money defending something that on its face might be unconstitutional based on both, by moving money from their general fund to support private schools, and then therefore our public schools would be hurt by that movement of funds. And then secondly, the religious piece of not being able to, under our Constitution, to support religious schools, and that would also be suspect. So not all private schools would apply for this particular bill.
Senator Chamberlain.
Thank you, Senator Sinjum and Senator Franson. Important question, of course, when we deal with this. In short, it is, we would expect nothing less than a court challenge of this, but we have a Blaine Amendment in Minnesota, but it's nuanced. It's our opinion that this type of scholarship credit is constitutional, both U.S. and state, and it passes those two tests. At the U.S. level, 3 court cases, one in 1983, one in 2002, and the last one in 2011. And that court case basically sets out, the first one, Zellman in 2002, I want to get this language correct here, basically says, where a government aid program is neutral with respect to religion, neutral, and provides assistance directly to a broad class of citizens, who in turn direct government aid to religious schools, is wholly a result of their genuine independent private choice. So what we have here is kind of a 3-piece test. We have the government is neutral to the religion or the school. It's a broad class of citizens, non-discriminatory, and it's a private individual making those choices. So to sum that up even more tightly, you have a private individual giving their money, their own money, to a private institution, and then that private institution then grants money to a private individual to make a private choice for another school. So private individual, private institution, then a third transaction between a private institution and an individual making their choices. The government is completely neutral on the religion and the school. There is a broad class of citizens. And lastly, it's an individual choice, as the Supreme Court has mentioned. That was the 1983 language, and that was reaffirmed in 2002 in Zellman, and then again in Wynn in 2011 in Ohio. So the U.S. Constitution is pretty solid on this. The Blaine Constitution, it will pass through Minnesota constitutional muster. The money never goes in the state treasury. The money never gets, this is not state money. It's not a dollar that goes to the government and then gets handed back to a citizen to take where they want. This money never hits the treasury. It's just they paid someone and now they're getting a tax benefit for it. There's no, this is just a reduction in tax revenues. It's not a dollar that comes in the treasury and then is handed back out. So this would pass U.S. constitutional muster based on the 3 cases, and would also pass state constitutional muster, state constitutional requirements as far as that goes too. So we're confident that would happen.
Senator Franson? Okay. Anyone else? Okay, at that, we can move to the testifiers then. Would Melanie Olson and Ron Hustvid, if I have that right, come forward, please.
Morning.
Welcome to the committee, Ms. Olson, and please state your name, and we look forward to your testimony.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. My name is Melanie Olson, and I teach grades 2 through 4 in a school within a school for highly gifted children in Buffalo, Hanover, Montrose schools. I have been an elementary school teacher for 14 years. I am very concerned about the new tax policy in the form of tax credits for private school scholarships. Our public schools and all of our students need your support. I ask you to please oppose this bill and instead support investments that we know will help public schools and all of our children. Increases to the formula, funding for voluntary pre-K, full-service community schools, and student support services. Before you give a tax break to corporations and rich individuals who donate to their schools of their choosing, You should first tax them so you can fund all schools. This committee, instead of giving a tax break, could tax corporations and fund special education, for instance. The state of Minnesota and the federal government so underfund our special education students that our districts are owed nearly $800 million. Raise taxes to help pay for that. In the Buffalo, Hanover, Montrose School District, special education cross-subsidy, ours is $5.9 million. We also have a budget deficit of $2.7 million in our district. As I mentioned earlier, I teach a self-contained program for highly gifted students. I work with our most academically gifted, and I also have children coming to school who are not ready to learn. They're not ready to learn because they struggle with a number of mental health needs, which are often of more concern to them than what I'm teaching. None of the elementary schools in my district have counselors. We have a social worker, who is often the one person we look to for support. In my school district, we have more general education students at the elementary level that are being referred for social work services than special education students. I have a sign that anyone walking by my classroom door can read, and it says, "All kids are our kids." And in public education, we don't pick and choose the students who come through our doors. We take them all, and we serve them the best that we can. At its very best, you're giving a tax break away to corporations while underfunding our most at-risk students. And at its worst, you are undermining the very public school system that strengthens our democracy. I'd like to read a quote from Tom Brokaw. "There is a place in America to take a stand. It is public education. It is the underpinning of our cultural and political system. It is the great common ground. Public education, after all, is the engine that moves us as a society toward a common destiny. It is in public education that the American dream begins to take shape. And as a teacher, I believe that. I hope that you would too. And if you do, I hope that you would not invest in tax breaks for private schools, but make a commitment to our public schools. Thank you.
So much, Ms. Olson. Mr. Hubstead, is that right?
Yeah, Hustovit, close enough.
Okay.
Good morning, Chair. Committee members, my name is Ron Hustovit from the Elk River School District at Sauk STEM Magnet Middle School. I'm in my 20-something year of teaching. I teach students as a social studies teacher to be civically minded and engaged, so that means I'm here today to practice what I preach. I've been twice awarded National Teacher of the Year honors, first in 2014 from the Magnet Schools of America, and most recently in 2016 from the National Council for the Social Studies. Because I believe strongly in accountability and transparency, I invite any of the committee members to my classroom at any time that you choose. Senator Kiffmeyer has, in our district, she has visited my classroom on multiple occasions, and we also reminisce about our time spent in the woods deer hunting for the first governor's deer hunting opener in 2003. When she was Secretary of State, I was her hunting guide for that cold adventure. But as much as I'd like to schmooze and tell stories, I'm here today because I'm gravely concerned with Senate File 1872, a bill that would create a new tax policy in the form of tax credits for private school scholarships, otherwise known as a bill that would diminish accountability, cloud up transparency, and harm scores of Minnesota students and their families. Senate File 1872 would do all of this under the guise of equity and opportunity. As a teacher in a public school, I am required to demonstrate how my students are succeeding and that they are being taught effectively. My school, a national magnet school of excellence, is required to demonstrate how we are doing by reporting on MCA and access scores. Private schools are not mandated or held accountable for the MCAs. They can administer another norm reference test, but public schools do not have that option. Students who leave the public schools for private or charter schools usually return to us further behind and frustrated with an unwillingness to provide the same level of support provided to all public school students. Students with special needs attend private and charter schools, but if those schools cannot provide those services, those students are serviced by the public funds in their home district. This puts an undue burden on the students, their families, special education teachers who already have huge caseloads, and consolidates those costs on the entire public school system. Minnesotans want the legislature to support investments that will help public school children and do so in a way that's equitable, transparent, and can be accounted for. They want money spent on education to increase the formula. That would make public schools better. They want full-service community schools. They want enough counselors and social workers to help support students. Who do you serve under the Minnesota Constitution? I thank Senator Franzen for quoting the same thing. The answer is in our Minnesota Constitution, where it says, the stability of a Republican form of government, depending mainly on the intelligence of the people, is the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools. That's about as clear as it gets. And it's as true today as it was when it was first adopted back in October of 1857. Think of how much broader the concept of public education is today than it was almost 162 years ago. Now it includes students of color, it includes girls and boys. Only recently does it include students with physical, cognitive, and mental disabilities. Let us rededicate ourselves to that great public cause on which our great state was founded. Vote for what will benefit students and the future of Minnesota. Vote against this bill.
Thank you so much. Senator Chamberlain, comment?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points is that Minnesota is, again, we're required to a FAPE, fair, appropriate public education. Exactly how the states do that, it's up to the states, and that's done by Constitution. Secondly, again, I'd like to remind people we give state money for preschool and for public or private preschool, and we give state grants for higher ed for public or private higher ed. Thirdly, this will not destroy schools. We want strong public schools. This will improve schools. The studies have shown it will improve schools. I know there's some concern that it will harm schools, but the studies over the last 20, 30 years compiled have shown that it improves schools. The latest study in 2016, they looked at 33 schools, and of the 33 schools for academics, those 33 public schools, 31 of those public schools improved in their academics. Their scores and everything improved. This also has been shown to save money for schools. Not a ton of money, but when a child leaves that school, state money doesn't stay, the state basic formula goes, but local money and federal money stays there. Finally, these schools are required, the qualified schools, the foundation cannot give this to any private school. A qualified school has to administer either the MCAs or another test that has been
Nationally normed.
yes, normalized to that to the MCAs. Thank you for reminding me. Normalize the MCA. Finally, the parents are the best people to hold folks accountable. The parents will hold these private schools accountable. Those are the folks that really, 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 truly have the most vested in these children. Educators are great, but the parents are going to hold the schools accountable, and that's the best way to do it. So those are my quick points, and we can continue now. Thank you.
Senator Chamberlain, I have a question maybe for the testifiers, and don't feel pressured. It's not throwing darts or anything like that, and I happen to be in a Rochester Public School last Friday with some third graders and elementary school, and it's just great, and we have great schools all over Minnesota. There's no question about that. But we also have schools in Minnesota that, and I'm not being, again, I'm not throwing darts at this, but graduate 40%, and I can wake up at night thinking about those kids in those schools. What are we doing wrong? What tools do we have available in the legislature for even beginning to fix a small portion of the future of some of those kids? And frankly, that's why I signed on this bill. It's almost on a personal basis like a feeling of desperation. What do we do to help some of these kids that are in these schools to which there's almost very little hope of graduation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. Well, I'm not sure of which school specifically you're talking about, and I think that there's room for improvement in any district. I went into education, the daughter of a superintendent, former MASA president, because I wanted more in my education. And so I've always looked for different ways to do something and be the teacher that I wanted that I didn't have. So I'm always looking at the systems of our schools and how we provide those services. I have a charter school that's just a few years old in my district. Their graduation rate is 7%. And that's a charter school, a school of choice. And so I think one thing that we can do is by supporting our public schools and also keeping them accountable and regulating their progress, I think that is a really good step that we can take. And I know that the bill said nationally normed tests. I would wonder what that is. I probably give 6 or 7 nationally normed assessments on a regular basis in my classroom to keep track of my students, and those go from fluency probes of how many words correctly you read a minute to, more something on mathematics. So it would be interesting to have more specific language about what those nationally normed tests are, because that can vary greatly. But I think by supporting all students and giving support to them, I think that is the greatest way to build and to keep schools accountable the way that we are in public schools.
Well, and not to belabor this, we've got to move along, but these same schools generally tend to get probably more pupil aid than any school in Minnesota. And yet they struggle, and I'm sure they're all good people, they're all working hard, but it's just difficult. How do we give some of these kids a hope? We're not going to be able to give all kids a hope, but how are we going to give some of these kids a hope? How do we get out of this?
Well, I would say also is funding special education is huge. I know in our district, we spend $12 million on special education services, and we get about half of that back because of funding. I teach the highly gifted, but because we're so good at qualifying, I also have about 1/3 of my students who are special ed. So they're highly gifted, and they also qualify for special ed services. We call it twice exceptional. Our case managers have 20+ kids. We have students that, as I mentioned, with counselors, they're coming with needs that we don't have. And so if we had support for student support services and fully funding special education, that would free up the people in your building who are most maxed to give support to them.
Okay, Senator Pratt's question, we need to move on, and we have other witnesses as well. Thank you to both, unless you have a question of the witnesses.
It is for the witnesses.
Okay. Why don't you just hold tight?
Well, and it's to follow up on kind of your question, Senator Senjum. Ms. Olson, you have a school within a school. Mm-hmm. You have students who have needs that aren't met through the normal classroom, so to speak.
Correct.
And, Mr. Hustved, you're part of a magnet school. Parents, it's not a neighborhood school. Parents choose to send their children to that school. Is that correct?
We have both neighborhood students, and about 1/3 of them are magnet school students.
What do you mean that 1/3 of them are main school students?
Magnet. A third of them are there through the magnet program.
Okay.
Which is through an integration district, and 2/3 are from the community.
But it's Mr. Chair and Mr. Husfeld, it's a parent's choice to send that student to that school.
To that public school, correct.
Okay. And there's a need that's being met in that magnet program that's not being met somewhere else. Is that correct?
Speaking as a parent of also magnet school students, yes,
Okay.
because it's the public
I
accountability
understand.
that we have there, yes.
I served on a school board for 12 years, so I understand. Are either of your school districts part of an alternative learning center? Do you have
Mr. Husted, I'm sorry.
either Ms. Olson or Mr. Husfed? You have opportunities for an alternative learning center that students and parents can choose to send their students to because their needs aren't being met in that classroom. Is that correct?
Either witness.
On the special education end, we do. We're part of Northwest Suburban, and so we do have resources for students who would qualify for those types of services. And oftentimes, their numbers are maxed, and they don't often, so we service them within our schools. And then we have schools just within our district that parents aren't choosing necessarily because needs aren't being met, but they're choosing them because they have a different focus that we've created in our district. In my program, the reason why it's something, needs to be something different is because I service students who are at the top 3% for ability, cognitive ability. Yet, again, many of them also have special education needs, so.
And I guess, Mr. Chair, my point is we have a lot of school choice that's already happening within the public education system with open enrollment, with programs like Mr. Hustved's and Ms. Olson's. We have alternative learning centers because what we've recognized, and I think Ms. Olson touched on it, is not every kid comes to school ready to learn. And that's, and this is where you touched on it, because every child's needs can be slightly different. Not every child's needs are met through the standard classrooms. And so we've created magnet schools, we've created schools within schools, we've created community schools, alternative learning centers. I know my community, we have parents, we have a great relationship with the parochial school and partner well. But it seems to me that this is, what we're talking about is the needs of the student. And I guess the question I've always had, and I'm not asking for an answer here, but I appreciate you, because Senator Chamberlain's bill also talks about transportation scholarships to help students get from public school to public school and help with the open enrollment. Because right now, and you guys know this as well, districts will only transport to the district boundary, and we have to, and so if a student in South Minneapolis wants to get to Edina or my district, Prior Lake, they can't do it. They have a barrier to keep them from meeting their educational needs or following the choice, even in public schools, that they want. And so, you know, I think this is a good bill because it looks at both the public and we tend to focus on the private, and I think some students need that structure. There's something there that happens, and Mr. Husved, if it doesn't work out for them, the parents have the choice to move their students back. That's the key to parental choice. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we need to move on, Senator Chamberlain, and thank you to the witnesses. We've got a couple of others on the opposition, I think, Mr. Adams and Mr. Boy, you know who you are. Yes, can you be brief, please? We've got to get to some other witnesses as well. And try to keep it to taxes.
Yes, Mr. Chair, my name is Kirk Schneider, I'm Executive Director for the Minnesota School Boards Association, and thanks for your attempt on that last name. So, so I'm here today to speak on behalf of our 333 school boards around the state and other educational organizations, the superintendents and some principals, as well as MREA. MSBA and others oppose state income tax deductions and credits. Our association has a long-standing policy position opposing state education funding for non-public schools and opposes tuition tax credits for attendance as well. Today, our public schools face growing special education cross-subsidy to the tune of almost $700 million statewide. In addition, we have over 90% of our school districts that have asked their community and citizens for referendums. Over 90% of our districts have those. So our public school districts have needs. We're also in a state that has robust public school choice programs, as you've talked about. Homeschool, charter schools, public schools, magnet schools, PSEO, online opportunities, private schools, and open enrollment. All of these options have made our public schools more responsive and competitive in serving their students and families and communities. MSBA believes that the top priority of the legislature should be to invest and fund our public schools and the 850,000 public school students that they serve. We do not believe that tuition tax credits, as in the case with this bill, is the best path to go. We believe that the $35 million perhaps could be invested in programs that help a majority of our public school students. We believe this is an opportunity lost that could be used to begin reducing the state's portion of the special ed, equalization for low property wealth districts, creative, innovative projects for our public school districts as well. So let's be clear, these credits will most likely be used for students already enrolled in private schools. Minnesota has a long tradition of supporting our locally governed public schools. We urge the committee to focus its effort on investing in our public school students in order to make our schools and communities which support them even stronger. Madam Chair, or Mr. Chair, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. And moving on then to Mr. Adams.
Yes, thank you, Chair Henjum, and members of the committee. I find it I'm Steve Adams. I'm a board member of the Hopkins School Board, treasurer, and also sit on the board of Intermediate District 287, which serves our special needs students for our district and 10 others. I find it incredible that we're sitting here talking about offering school tax credits for private schools, people that send their kids to private schools when we have not yet fully funded our public schools. The general education inflationary increases continue to eat away at any additional funding we get. The governor's bill this year, I sat through the hearing on it yesterday, that will only allow us to tread water for a few more years. We are not yet back to the 2003 education spending levels adjusted for inflation. The gap between the expenses for mandated special education services and the funding for those services that is provided by the state legislature and Congress continues to grow. Mr. Schneiderwin alluded to the $750 million gap between what we get in funding for special ed and what we have to provide. In Hopkins, that amounts to $7 million this year. We've got a $7 million gap that is going to be filled by our property taxpayers in our district. It's a funding gap created by the legislature and by Congress. In addition, pre-kindergarten education, which has proven to be the highest payback in terms of educational outcomes, is barely funded in Minnesota. In Hopkins, we have a waiting list of parents who would like to participate in our Ready for K program, but can't because of lack of funding. So we have to ration our pre-K services to parents who we think are most deserving. When we started the program, the state provided no funding for this service. It was all funded by our property taxpayers in our district. Gradually, the state legislature started to provide some funding, which is up to almost 25% of our costs. We would include more families in our Ready for K program if we could get the legislature to provide adequate funding. In short, it's irresponsible to divert public spending from public education to private education when we have so many unmet needs in public education. So I'm speaking in opposition to this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. And Senator Howitt, a question or comment?
Well, it's a question, and it's to
We
Senator.
need to keep it brief.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It will be Senator Chamberlain. I've got a school district in my district that has a bunch of businesses that funds a foundation to provide money to their school for technology education and programs. Would not that foundation, if they'd went through the proper channels, qualify for this tax credit, those businesses that donate to that foundation, if they went through this process?
Mr. Chair and Senator Howe, yes.
Thank you. So I can see where that type of a process can benefit the businesses that donate to the foundations that support our public schools. That's what I want to get at, so thank you.
Senator Chamberlain, it probably wouldn't be for football helmets, it would be for scholarships.
Yeah, we wouldn't do that. You're right, correct.
Okay. Department of Revenue would like to
Thank you, Mr.
testify. Thank you to both witnesses. Ms. Byers, would you come forward? Bears, I guess it is. We're getting used.
Bear, like the aspirin.
Bear. Welcome to committee, Ms. Byers. Proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Joanna Bears, and I'm the Legislative Director for the Minnesota Department of Revenue. As already described, this bill makes several changes to the existing K through 12 credit and creates a new income tax credit. I'll start with the changes to the K through 12 credit. The proposal indexes the maximum K through 12 credit amount for inflation and the income at which the credit begins to phase out. These proposed changes are not concerning. However, the proposal goes on to expand the expenses eligible for the K through 12 credit to non-public school tuition and the cost of transportation to the school. This would increase the funding of non-public schools through reimbursements with public dollars at the time when the state should be funding the significant needs of the public schools. The new income tax credit established by this bill would allow a credit of 70% of contributions made to a 501c3 organization that awards scholarships to qualifying students to attend a non-public elementary or secondary school. The maximum credit is $10,500 or $21,000 for joint returns or $105,000 for corporations. The credit is not refundable, but any credit amount not used may be carried forward for up to 5 years. Having a carry forward makes this tax credit unlike any other state tax credit for individual income taxes in Minnesota. This proposal also treats contributions to these foundations different for contributions to other charitable foundations. There are many worthy causes funded across Minnesota by contributors to charities. This bill would provide a significant, more beneficial tax result for those contributing to these selected foundations, creating unequal treatment across charities. Another concern with this credit is that there's very little accountability to measure whether or not this is effective at or actually creating positive outcomes. With public schools, we know the schools are following state and federal accountability requirements. Private schools do not have to take state tests, nor are they subject to other standards of accountability, so there isn't a good way to measure how well the student that would potentially receive an increased number of scholarship as a result of this tax credit would perform compared to other public school counterparts. The proposal also establishes a credit for donations to public school foundations to fund students' transportation needs. While this is admirable, the solution is to fund public schools so they can provide full services to students. It is concerning to note that requirements placed on a public schools that 30% of their student population be receiving free or reduced student lunch. No similar requirement is imposed on private schools. Beyond the larger accountability, equity, and effectiveness questions, there are serious concerns with how this credit would be administered. The time for approving the qualified foundation is September 15, 2019, and an application must be made available by August 2019. This provides a small time frame for the department to set up the initial application for the foundations to apply. This proposal would spend over $100 million over the budget window. This is a significant tax benefit giving preferential treatment to certain charitable causes in Minnesota over the equally and worthy causes, while diverting public money to private schools. Because a provision of this bill provides public funding to finance private K-12 education, the governor opposes this bill. Thank you.
Ayers, any questions?
Can I just make a clarification, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Again, these qualified schools, the money cannot go to just any school. The qualified school has to administer the MCA or a norm-based test, and that those results have to be on the website. Be clear, everybody in front of me, behind me, on the cameras, on Facebook, and across this state. These qualified schools have to abide by MCAs or norm-based tests, and they have to be available on the website, period. Anything else is just not correct. And this is not state money. It reduces the state money, but it's not state money. This money never hits the Treasury. It never hits the state bank. Never. Not a dime, not a cent, not for a second. It never goes there. That's why the Supreme Court says this is constitutional. So I just want to make those 2 points very boldly and underlined. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator.
I didn't know the Department of Revenue was going to talk about education policy, but we welcome that as well here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Moving on then. So Mr. Benito
Matias. Yeah.
Okay, welcome to committee. Please introduce yourself and proceed with your testimony.
Absolutely. Mr. Chair and members, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify this morning. As was mentioned, my name is Benito Matias. I have the honor of serving as the principal at Ascension Catholic School in North Minneapolis. I've been in education for about 25 years, of which the last 10 I've been an administrator. I was born and raised in Minneapolis and am a proud graduate of Patrick Henry High School in Minneapolis and a graduate of Dunwoody College in Minneapolis and a graduate of Bemidji State University. Ascension is dedicated to the development of academic excellence. We aim to prepare our scholars to become productive citizens, and for us as a K-8 school, it's extremely important that we prepare our scholars to be successful at a rigorous high school, being the next step in their lives. We have about 340 or so scholars in our K-8 classes, the majority of which, probably about 95% of them, live within a 5-mile radius. We get that question a lot: do you serve scholars within the immediate area? And the answer is absolutely yes. About 95+% of those scholars are scholars of color. In any given year, we have 65 to 85% of our scholars who qualify for free and reduced lunch. We support the Equity and Opportunity Scholarships bill because we believe every child and, frankly, every parent in Minnesota should have that choice in terms of where their scholars attend school. We want to welcome children to our school without regard to financial situation. Our school's been around since the late 1890s. It's always been the position of our parish and of our school that we don't ever want to turn away any family due to inability to pay. So we've always worked with families to help to make it possible for them to attend our school. Opportunity scholarships will break down the financial barriers for low and middle income families, allowing them to select what they believe to be the best fit for their family and for their scholar. We have countless course stories. I know we're limited in time in terms of scholars attending our school. I always say to folks, we do not have a monopoly on despair, although we have situations that scholars experience in our building that, frankly, no adult should experience. And we have scholars each and every day who have come to our school, who have had success with us that they haven't had in other school settings. And that's not to discount the other school settings, but I think it just emphasizes the point that not every school is the right fit for every scholar or for every family. But we've had many scholars and many families who have found the right fit with us, and we are grateful for that opportunity. Members, I encourage you to support Senator Chamberlain's bill and help more scholars access the education and learning environment that is the best fit for them. Thank you very much for having this time this morning.
Okay, questions for Mr. Mateus? Sensing none, welcome to committee, and I'm going to presume it is Ms. Young.
Yes. Please excuse me, I've never
Please
done this
introduce
before.
yourself as well.
And my name is Sheila Young. I'm a parent, grandparent now. My son attended Ascension, and I really want this bill supported. It's something parents and grandparents, we need this to be able to have this choice. Because I feel that I might have got lost. I was a working single parent. I worked for the Postal Service, raising my son, and it was a blessing that I had this choice to be able to put my son in Ascension. And evidently it was a great choice because when he had his two, which now my granddaughter's there, my grandson's with me right now, he will be there in June. We just need to make the choice ourselves, and we want to be supported. I support this bill because as just a parent, period, and I'm sure most of all you are parents, some kind of way, whether it's yours or not. This is what it says. It takes a village to raise a child, and this is what we have to do.
So much.
Thank you. I have no notes, so.
Any questions of Ms. Young? We have one more, Ms. Lynn Wright. She's in the audience. Please come forward. Or it could be Lynn on the male side. She's not here. Okay. Okay. Senator Dietzig is presenting this. Okay. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Wright. Please state your name and proceed to your testimony.
My name is Lynn Wright. Oh, I'm a little nervous. I am a product of St. Peter Claver School. I graduated in 1963.
Can you move it a little closer to yourself?
Is that better?
That's better, yes.
Okay, I went to St. Peter Claver School. I graduated in 1963. I was there for 8 years. I graduated from St. Paul Central High School in 67. I have 4 children. I had 3 that attended St. Peter Claver, and then I had 1 that was there when it closed in 1988, he graduated from St. Agnes. He never attended a public school because I was having him tested for early admission, and because he asked too many questions, they wanted to put him on meds. They didn't even want to answer his questions. So anyway, I kept him in a Catholic school. I worked for the St. Paul schools after St. Peter Claver closed, and I worked in special ed for 18 years. I saw kids just being passed through. A lot of the kids that I work for are now in prison because they couldn't read, they couldn't write, and I'm not putting down the St. Paul schools, but I feel like St. Peter Claver was part of the Rondo community, and it still is part of the Rondo community. It's family-oriented. Kids can pray. Kids need to be able to know that there is God. And when you're in another setting, you can't pray. Kids come to me in the morning, they just want to say good morning, or hi, they call me grandma. They pray, they want to pray with you. And I just think it's really important that this bill is passed so parents have the right to put their kids where they want to, in a smaller class setting. Kids that come to school with needs and are already in a class of 30 kids, how can you serve them? We're getting kids from St. Paul schools that are not being served because there's too many kids. And it's not anybody, it's not their fault, it's not the school, but there are too many kids in these classrooms, and kids aren't being served. And it's a lot of kids of color.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wright. We really appreciate you coming today and your testimony. Questions of Ms. Wright? If not, I'm going to presume, Senator Chamberlain, that
That's up to me.
all witnesses are in, and you have an opportunity for concluding comments.
They have said it all. We've had plenty of good discussion. I've taken too much time. Thank you, members. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the questions. Solutions, opportunities, new hope for these old stubborn problems. It's just another alternative, as Senator Bach alluded to. And it's so very important for these parents and these families to have that choice. We do it in all other facets. It doesn't ruin public schools. It will enhance them. It will strengthen them, and we'll all be much better for it. Most importantly, the students will have much greater opportunities as we move forward. So I hope and pray everybody will consider this thoughtfully as we move forward, and hope some of you will change your hearts, and we'll get this done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.